All right, everybody, good morning. So we're going to have we have only 3 lectures left in the semester. All right. I went back over the calendar yesterday, and yes, in the calendar, there is a quiz on the Tuesday that you return from Thanksgiving break, right? The updated calendar has removed it because I went back and I do not, as a general thing. I don't like to give you assignments or have you studying over breaks or holidays. Weekends don't count. That's where you can double down. But breaks and holidays, no. All right. So there won't be one then. And actually, I need that time because normally I have under normal circumstances, I have a couple of lectures for both the urinary system and the respiratory system, but due to all the changes in the fall calendar, these got compressed into one lecture apiece. The digestive system could also roll into that, but it's compressed as well. So for the next 3 lectures, digestion, urinary, respiratory, we have one lecture period for all of them. Okay. So I don't have time to give a 20-minute quiz. So you don't have to study over the week, over the holidays. However, we will have your last exam, exam 3, on your last day of class, which will be the last Thursday, or the first Thursday in December. Okay. All right. With those announcements, let's proceed with the digestive system. All right. Now, in the digestive system, I mean, for most of you, this is not one of your preferred systems, and that's fine, though it's absolutely critical because the purpose of the digestive system is to acquire nutrients and required elements, including water, which are necessary to maintain your life. Because you're not a self-sustaining organism. You have to bring in things from the outside in order to maintain metabolism, to create energy, ATP. Remember when we were we'll come back to this, revisit this at the end of this series, but obviously oxidative phosphorylation, all right, requires different sources of energy coming in. And where do those come from? Ultimately, they either have to come from catabolism, that's breaking your body down to create those metabolic nutrients, or bring it from the outside. All right. So this is bringing it from the outside. Right now, next is that beyond metabolism, energy, beyond replacement cells and maintaining tissues and organs, that's everything that digestive system is about. Next, basically, your primary digestive tract, which is called the alimentary tract or your gastrointestinal tract, is a tube structure that begins with your mouth and ends with your anus. And anything, just to remind you from the introductory lectures, anything in that luminal space of that tube is outside the body. I don't care if the large intestine is in the middle of your abdominal cavity. Anything in that lumen is outside of your body. All right. Now, there is huge variability along that tube structure. We'll get into that today. One obvious question is, why is your digestive system on the inside? Think about a housefly or even a spider. A housefly will, and you may not like this, but you don't want flies landing on your food. What do? They regurgitate out their digestive juices onto whatever they land on, and then they slurp it back in. So the primary digestion occurs outside their body, right? What about a spider? A spider injects a venom which contains proteases, which solubilizes everything inside except for the shell, then they suck it in. All right. We don't do that. What are the advantages of ingestion? Is that you can eat and move. Okay. So that means you can overeat or something, and then everything's inside. Plus, when we get into the chemical part, the chemical digestion is optimized for pH and temperature. Core body temperature, 37 degrees. So chemical digestion is optimized for those temperatures. So that's not going to occur outside the body, depending on whatever the conditions are, especially not right now. All right. So your digestive system. Now, what you're seeing here is a schematic of the digestive system, and I want to demonstrate using this that there is only one side of ingestion, and that is via your mouth. Yes, yes, yes. You can snort liquids down your nasal cavity, but ultimately will get into your digestive system. We do not normally consume foodstuffs this manner. We ingest them through the mouth, all right? So there's only one side of ingestion, and there's only one side of elimination, the anus, right? Now, what is also required to have an effective digestive system is, number one, there has to be some way of propelling what we've consumed and passing it down through this tube structure. So there's some form of propulsion, and we'll cover that. Then there are two aspects in which we break down food such that it's compatible to absorption to inside the body. One is mechanical. Think about your teeth. The purpose of your teeth is to chew your food, to masticate it, to create smaller components. Then your tongue folds that into a bolus that's compatible with swallowing, right? Your tongue isn't just taste. It has other functions as well. All right, now, we have mechanical digestion. There's also mechanical digestion during propulsion down the tube structure. We'll cover that. And then there's chemical digestion. And chemical digestion occurs for specific foodstuffs at specific positions, which we'll cover. Some of that occurs in the mouth via saliva, but this is specific only for carbohydrates, specifically starch, because the enzyme is amylase that is secreted by your salivary glands, and they initiate digestion of carbohydrates in the mouth. No chemical digestion for either proteins or fats occurs here. We get to the stomach. We now begin chemical digestion of proteins, but no additional chemical digestion of carbohydrates or lipids. We move now into the small intestine, which is next down. This is where all chemical digestion for all three finally occur, because this is a primary site for absorption of nutrients. Okay, so that gets us to absorption. So absorption primarily occurs in the small intestine, to a lesser extent in the large intestine, i.e. colon, right? Now, absorption, that all depends on what we're talking about. So the food you eat has to be broken down into constituent elements so that it's compatible with absorption across the epithelial barrier, which lines that gastrointestinal tract. So that means proteins need to be broken down to amino acids, complex carbohydrates to simple sugars, fats into fatty acids, and so on. These are only compatible for absorption. Once they absorb, they go different places. Ultimately, they end up in the liver, passing through the liver. But in the case of amino acids, in the case of sugars, they are absorbed via the bloodstream, and they go to the liver via the portal vein. In the case of fats, they do not go directly to blood. They go to the lymphatic system. Ultimately, they end up in the blood. But first, the lymphatic system. All right, this is everything I just talked about. All right, you can review this on your own. Now, teeth are considered part of the digestive system, part of the mechanical digestion. Can you live without them? Sure. Not highly desirable, but that means that you can't use them to do the types of mastication they're associated with. But that's beyond what I want to talk, because I could spend a lot of time, and this is not over at the dental school at Pitt, so I'm not going to have a whole course on teeth. I've got one slide on a tooth. This is a representative anatomical rendition of an individual generalized tooth based on an incisor. So I want you to note several things. right? The tooth rests in a socket. The socket is bone. That's basically the upper, the lower jaw. There is a socket and the tooth rests inside. However, that tooth is not directly fused to that bone. It is held in place by periodontal ligaments. Remember, what is a ligament? Bone to bone, or in this case, tooth to bone. Because teeth, like bones, are naturally mineralized tissues. They consist of both inorganic and organic components. Now, in the case of the tooth, that part of the tooth that is exposed within the oral cavity, that means it's seeing all the crap you eat, and it has all those microbiomes associated with it, is lined with enamel. This is the hardest substance in the human body, right? You all have your secondary teeth. They're all the teeth you're ever going to have. And if you have a calorie in which bacteria degrade and create a hole in that enamel, that means that things can get inside that tooth, right? And not a good thing. Eventually, you could lose that tooth, all right? So we have enamel, the hardest thing in the body. Inside that, we see this blue structure. This is the dentine. This is hard, but not as hard as enamel. And basically inside that, in the center, we have the pulp cavity. This contains blood vessels and nerves, right? Now, because the tooth is a living thing, just like bones are living things. That means because they're bigger than a millimeter cubed, they have to have a vascular supply, right? Now, also, what if you'll note up here, there's a soft tissue that overlies your mandibles, and this is creates a soft seal against the tooth, okay? And these are your gums, right? So why are your gums important in context to tooth health? If you have a properly healthy gingiva, that means we get the soft tissue of the gum up against the tooth. That means that bacteria can't get between the tooth and the gum and set up shop here, somewhere in the socket. If you have inflammation of the gums and the gums pull away a little bit, bacteria can get between the gum and the teeth. They can colonize under here. They can create an inflammatory environment that degrades the periodontal ligaments, that degrades that tooth and the surrounding subchondral bone, and loosens the tooth. Okay? Not a good thing. So that's it. That's all I'm going to talk about teeth. It's not that they're not important, but I only have one lecture period. All right? Next thing, ingestion. Right? So you've bitten off a piece of breakfast. I don't care what it is, a piece of bagel, right? You put it in your mouth. You chew it up. Your teeth tend to masticate it to a certain extent. Your tongue plays a critical role because it's moving it around the mouth and forming it into a bolus that is compatible with being swallowed. All right? Now, there is a reflex action when you swallow, because there are two tube structures that food bolus can go down. It can either go into the esophagus and entering the digestive tract, or it can enter the respiratory tract in the trachea. We do not want it in the trachea. So what happens when you swallow, the trachea is closed off, and the food goes down to the digestive system, which i.e. means it enters the esophagus, the beginning. From there, when we swallow, it then proceeds to the stomach. Now, your esophagus is about this long, all right? Not terribly long. Think about it, about 6-8 inches, right? Now, this tube structure, we'll get to details in a moment, but is surrounded by smooth muscle cells. Remember their role in rhythmic contractions. So when you swallow, that initiates this peristaltic contraction of the esophagus, which will propel and force that bolus down the length from your mouth down to your stomach. Now, this process allows you to defy gravity, which means that you can eat standing on your head, because peristalsis will go against gravity. All right? Now, then what happens is this bolus is coming down to the end. where it now is going, the esophagus transitions into the stomach. There's a sphincter here that's normally closed. This opens, material comes into play, dumps into the stomach, swallowing and ingestion is complete. Okay. Now, the thing to also remember about the esophagus is just a tube that connects your mouth to your stomach. It has one goal, and that is to get the food from your mouth to your stomach. There is no chemical, no mechanical digestion occurring in the esophagus. It is just a connecting structure. All right? Now, this is a good place for me to reemphasize peristalsis. Peristalsis is this rhythmic contractions of smooth muscles around this soft, about your gastrointestinal tract tube structure, and that then provides a net forward movement direction of that swallowed bolus. Okay, so everything is a forward moving from your mouth toward your anus. However, that's not exactly right. There is this concept called segmentation. Segmentation works like this. So we have a structure where we're not in the esophagus, because that is just to get the food stuff to the stomach. Like we get the small intestine, and that's around 20 feet long. Okay, it's a very long tube structure, and we need to move stuff through that structure. What happens though, instead of having a net forward movement, thinking about peristalsis, which means just going in this direction, we have the concept of segmentation. The way I want you to think about segmentation is like dance steps. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So there is a net overall forward movement, but there's a back and forth element to that. In terms of peristalsis, that results in mixing those adjacent boluses that are going down that tube. All right? Why is this important? Because chemical digestion is only going to occur at the surface of that bolus, this surface. Okay, because those enzymes have to get, but those enzymes, that means that without segmentation, it takes a bloody long time to digest this from the outside toward the inside. Segmentation is mixing everything up. That's not only mixing up that food bolus material, it's also incorporating digestive enzymes in that bolus. So now you have more efficient chemical digestion throughout the whole bolus, not just from the surface. So it greatly enhances the chemical digestion, right? But it's also a form of mechanical digestion, this mixing aspect of it, all right? It's mixing, but it's improving the efficiency of chemical digestion at the same time. All right, now, just like with any system in the body, there are controls. Now, just like any system in the body, we have 2 aspects of control. We have intrinsic, which means that all the control is within that organ, within that tissue, or extrinsic, which means some aspect is outside of that organ, i.e., say, the central nervous system. All right? So such is the case with digestion. All right? It's a mixture of both. Right? That's basically all I want you to get from this. Now, regulation can be brought about by a number of things. For instance, your stomach think of it like a balloon, okay? When you haven't eaten in a while, the balloon collapses like this, right? When you start to eat, what are you doing? You're filling that balloon, and it stretches, right? That results in activation of mechanical receptors in your stomach, which basically it can translate ultimately to cessation. You're full, don't eat anymore, all right? Now, in terms of stuff entering the stomach, your stomach is designed to operate under acid pH conditions, right? You just had some yogurt. Yogurt is not acid. It is a neutral pH, if not a slightly alkaline pH. You swallow that, the stomach, there are chemical receptors that recognize this elevation in pH, and so they're going to secrete acid to bring that pH back down. Okay? So that's a local control within the stomach as well. All right? Now, Thanksgiving is next Thursday. It's a week away. So you, wherever you're going or not, You know, let's say you're going to someone's house, maybe not your own, to have a Thanksgiving dinner of some sort. Now you've heard, and maybe it's your first one, it doesn't matter. You've heard about it and you've starved for at least 12 hours because you want to make sure that you can eat everything you want to eat. Okay. Now, you're you're not even there. So it's time for you to get there. You're traveling, you're outside of wherever the home is that you're going to, and you're thinking about eating, right? You're starting to salivate because you haven't eaten in hours, okay? Been looking forward to this. You open the door and the smell of the food hits you. What's going to happen? Your stomach starts rumbling because it's getting ready to eat. And then you taste that food, all right? Then you swallow that food. So all aspects of that represent a range of regulation from extrinsic toward intrinsic. Now, remember when I talked about the reproductive suckling reflexes and how that, since it operates through the brain, you don't even have to suckle the breast. The mother just has to think about, and she can have milk let down. And the same thing about food, all right? Because it's going through the brain too, some aspect of that regulatory process. Okay? So this is basically what I was just talking about, so I'm going to proceed on past this. And now let's talk about the basic anatomy of that gastrointestinal tract tube structure. It's a tube structure, but it's rather complex. There are multiple layers. So I'll show you a graphic representation in a moment, but let's talk about the structures first. The first, we have this tube structure, and then let's go from the inside out. So the luminal space on the inside, the closest layer that contacts the lumen is referred to as the mucosal layer. This is the most complex layer within this tube structure. Along the length of the gastrointestinal tract, there's huge variability in how that tube structure looks, but the primary aspects of the layers that change is in this mucosal layer. So the mucosal layer directly contacts everything in the luminal space, all right? It's involved with, obviously, everything that has to enter into the body has to cross this layer. So it's your primary barrier. So it also forms a protective aspect because in your gastrointestinal tract, there are trillions of cells which aren't part of your body. That's your microbiome, all right? So they need to stay in that lumen. They don't need to cross that gastrointestinal layers to get inside your body because some of those organisms would just like to eat you, all right? So we have the mucosal layer is secreting stuff, everything from mucus to enzymes, hormones. We'll talk about that momentarily. It's where absorption happens and, again, protection. Those are the three primary roles of the mucosal layer. Now, the sublayers are, the innermost layer is the epithelium. So there are epithelial cells that line the entire tract, right? This represents the outermost layer. Now, they can have different types of cells which are secreting everything from mucus to hormones and so on. We drop on down, we have what is referred to as the laminal propria. This is that layer just inside. This has connective tissue. These epithelial cells are bound to that. It holds them in place. There's some capillaries. There's some lymphatic tissues here as well. We move on down. We have the muscularis muscae. This has more smooth muscle cells. And basically, however, they're not involved in propulsion. What they do is they're designed to, if you have a tube structure and their food starts to stick to the surface, they move around so they can dislodge that material, but they're not responsible for this net forward movement of propulsion. Okay? From the mucosal layer, we go to the submucosal layer, and this has more connective tissue and more blood vessels, more lymphatics, and it also has elastic fibers because this tube structure, I think I told you your stomach swells, contracts, and so all this tube structure can expand and contract. It has elastic elements. We move on down. We have the muscularis sterni. This is what contains lots of smooth muscle cells. They're involved with propulsion. They're involved with segmentation as well as peristalsis, and they're forming the sphincters. So sphincters, you have a sphincter at the anterior portion of the stomach, the posterior portion of the stomach, you have sphincters as your rectum, okay, your anus. So basically they can completely close off those luminal spaces. The last outermost layer of the gastrointestinal tract is referred to as the serosa. This has a dense connective tissue, and it is the final barrier protecting inside your body from what is in that luminal space. Okay? So these are all the layers that are associated all along the entire length of the gastrointestinal tract. Here is anatomic representation of what those layers look like. So the lumen is in the center. Then we have our epithelial cells and our submucosa, and then etc. All right. So basically, this, I don't care where you're at, whether you're in the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the colon, it all basically looks like this. However, your stomach technically doesn't look like this. But it has all those basic layers. The one that changes the most as we go down the length of this gastrointestinal tract is your mucosal layer. All right. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Before I do, let me put the anatomy all together. This is your digestive system. Again, beginning with your mouth, ending with your anus. You go from your mouth, you have your tongue, you have your teeth, you have your salivary glands. We drop down the esophagus, which then goes to the stomach. From the stomach, we go to the small intestine. The small intestine has three zones, if you will. The one that's closest to the stomach is the duodenum. From the duodenum, we move to the jejunum, which is the center part. And then the last part before we enter the colon or the large intestine is the ileum. All right. Then, in terms of the large intestine or the colon, they mean the same thing. So we transition here between the small intestine and the colon, and there's this little structure here that you see here. Here is the appendix. Now, technically, it's vestigial, but it performs function. All right, it's part of the immune system. Remember we talked about that. Now, we move into the colon, and the colon is divided into three zones. We have the ascending colon, which is moving up toward your head. Then we have the transverse colon, which is going across, and then the descending colon, which is dropping back down toward the pelvis and transitions into the anus, rectum, and then out the anus. All right. So that is your gastrointestinal tract. Accessory digestive organs are primarily the salivary glands, your teeth, the liver, and the pancreas. And we'll talk about those functions in a bit. All right. So this is the anatomy of the overall digestive system. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about really digging into detail about metabolism and so forth. I don't have time. So what I want to talk about is, and I don't want to focus on absorption of minerals and water and all of that. I want to focus on basically three primary aspects: proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. These are primarily involved with both metabolism, which I've already talked about, plus they're critical building blocks to form replacement cells and tissues. All right. So let's talk just a little bit, and I do expect you to remember this. Hint, hint. So basically, we'll start with carbohydrates. As I told you earlier today, complex carbohydrates are not absorbed. They have to be broken down to simple sugars. All right. I don't care whether it's milk or whatever. I mean, they have to be broken down to simple sugars. Now, sure, you can ingest simple sugars, like, for instance, fructose, glucose, galactose, but typically speaking, we don't. Okay? You've had a piece of bread. You've had whatever, some starchy something. All right? It's a complex carbohydrate. It means it's comprising simple sugars. But it has to be broken down to those simple sugars before it can be absorbed into the body. All right? Now, as I've already mentioned, chemical digestion of carbohydrates begins in the mouth. Amylase, right? So that is responsible for degrading starch and converting it to a simple sugar. Now, I can still remember back many, many, many decades ago when I was in elementary school and we had science. I can remember one where we were talking about how does amylase work. And what we did is all the students were given a cracker. Everybody knows what a cracker is, right? You put it in your mouth, it has a starchy taste, right? So how does amylase work? So here's what this is what we did. You took a cracker, you put it on top of your tongue, and you held that against the roof of your mouth. Initially, it has a starchy taste, correct? Floury, starchy taste. Now, after about 30 seconds or a little bit longer, it starts to transition from starchy to sweet. And that's because the amylase is converting the starch to sugar. And the taste buds in your tongue are translating that from starch to sugar. All right? Now, once that carbohydrates get to the stomach, nothing's happening. They're just they're along for the ride. However, once they go into the small intestine, this is where chemical digestion really jumps into play. These complex sugars are broken down to simple sugars, and these simple sugars then are absorbed. They go directly into the bloodstream and via that to the liver, via the portal vein, right? Next, proteins. Proteins, as you already know, are chains of amino acids. They have to be broken down to individual or by amino acids to be absorbed, right? So that means proteolysis. That means proteases, okay? Now, I've already mentioned this earlier in the semester, but I told you that cells that are secreting proteases do not secrete them as active enzymes. Otherwise, they chew up the source cells. They are produced as zymogens, which are inactive precursors, and they have to be activated outside of the cell source, and this is controlled, all right, in the digestive system. And proteins, this is what happens. There is no chemical digestion in your mouth of proteins. Proteins now enter the stomach. Not only is it an acid pH, it has proteolysis occurring because there is pepsin, which is pepsinogen is activated to pepsin. Pepsin is an acid-activated protease, and that begins chemical digestion of proteins. We now transition to the small intestine. This is where everything gets active because there's multiple proteases. Ultimately, they're resulting in breaking down these complex proteins into amino acids, which then can be absorbed into the bloodstream and go to the liver. Lastly, we have fats. Remember, fats are not soluble in water. So there's a couple of problems here. So there is no chemical digestion of fat either in the mouth or the stomach. We get into the small intestine, things happen. So chemical digestion of fats is complex because, number one, we have low solubility in water, and so that means fat forms these big globules, which makes it inefficient for chemical digestion because it restricts this on the surface. We need to maximize surface to volume ratio. How do we do that? We saponify those fats, just like putting dish detergent in your dishwashing dish liquids and showing how it disperses the fat. It works the same way. The bile salts saponify, so they break down these huge globules of fat into a lot smaller particles, increasing surface area, increasing the efficiency of chemical digestion. All right, the various lipases that are designed to break those lipids down. Now, when also the bile salts facilitate and enable chemical digestion, but they also play a critical role in absorption of those degraded aspects of the lipid, like fatty acids. They help to transport them across the epithelial layer not into blood, but into the lymphatic system. Remember, for fats, it's always the lymphatic system for absorption. I do expect you to understand the differences between these three items in terms of chemical digestion and where they're absorbed, etc. All right? Okay, let's talk about the stomach for a little bit. So the stomach has two primary roles. The stomach acts it has three. Number one, we eat stuff and we just need to hold it, and that's what the stomach serves. Okay? I mean, when you eat and go, it can hold a lot of stuff. Okay, so eat a meal. That's why you don't have to eat constantly. Number two, it protects you. We do not eat sterile food. Okay, you can, but we don't. And so the stomach is acidified. That is to protect you because most pathogenic bacteria are susceptible to acid pH. So it helps to protect you against potential pathogenic bacteria or other microorganisms you may have consumed along with that meal. I mean, when you eat a salad, it is got all kinds of crap on it, all kinds of microorganisms. All right. You don't cook it. You can't cook. Well, you can cook lettuce. I cook lettuce at home, but it's not the same thing. If I want a salad, that means raw vegetables. That means I'm eating bacteria. All right. As well as fungi and viruses, etc. All right. So aside from that, there is chemical digestion that is occurring, at least in terms of proteins. All right. So there's lots of stuff happening in the stomach. Now, I've already told you that the mucosal layer is the most complex, that changes as we go along the gastrointestinal tract. In the case of the lining of the stomach, this is a perfect place for me to introduce gastric pits because they are unique to the stomach. They only occur in the stomach mucosal layer. Now, I'll show you a picture of them in a moment, but let's talk about the pit structure, and then depending if you're close to the lumen, the cells at the top of the pit are different from the cells that are deep in that pit. The ones that are nearest the surface are called the mucous neck cells. They're responsible for secreting some acids, mucus secretions, but they are different from goblet cells, which are down in a moment here. Let's talk about parietal cells. They are down in the mid part of this pit. They then are secreting both acid and intrinsic factor. Remember, intrinsic factor is critical for vitamin B12 absorption. And they basically are maintaining the overall acid pH conditions of the stomach. So if you eat that yogurt, they're jumping into play and secreting extra acid to acidify what you just ate. Okay? This acid conditions activates pepsinogen, the zymogen for pepsin, and makes it to the active pepsin. Pepsin is only active at acid pH. If you neutralize the pH, you kill the enzyme. Right? It's kind of unique in that way. Right? Now, chief cells are also there. They're the ones that they're secreting the pepsinogen, that zymogen. And then we move on down, we have actually the endocrine cells, the enteroendocrine cells, because yes, they're secreting hormones. And basically, they're gastrin, histamine, endorphins, and so on, cholecystokinin, secretin, etc. This is just a short list, as you're going to see in a little bit. All right. So all of this is happening in the gastric pits. All right. And then these things that they're releasing go out of the lumen of the pit into the central stomach area. Now, this is a good place for me to talk about the mucosal barrier. So wait a minute. When you think about it, the stomach in the luminal space, it's pretty wicked. It's an acid pH. You've got pepsins, pepsin protease activity. What is protecting those epithelial cells? Because why doesn't it just digest your mucosal layer? That's because your epithelial cells are protected by this mucosal barrier. This is a bicarbonate-rich mucosal layer that actually is between the epithelial cells and the lumen contents. So the luminal contents, the acidified pepsin-rich material doesn't come in direct contact with the epithelial cells because of this barrier. All right? Now, even though, and then we could talk when we get further down applied to the entire gastrointestinal tract and the epithelial cells, this environment is pretty hostile to the epithelial cells. In the case of the stomach, we got acid, and then we have these proteases. Further down into the small intestines, we have a neutral pH, but we got lots of proteases. And this segmentation and movement of what you're eating, especially if you're eating a lot of roughage and fiber, it's actually starting to damage those epithelial cells. So that is one of the reasons why the lining epithelial cells of your gastrointestinal tract are replaced within a week and less than a week, because it's an extremely hostile environment. So they're constantly being shed and replaced. Okay. Now, here is the cartoon rendition of your actual gastric pits, showing you how they actually look. All right. Now, I'm not going to go into the stimulatory and inhibitory effects here. I've kind of already covered that. This is just focused on the stomach. But I do want you to note up here, then note how the mucosal layer is the primary. That's the primary one that differs along the length of the gastrointestinal tract. Your other layers, your serosal layer and all of that, they basically are the same. It's that mucosal layer that changes. And those gastric pits are unique to the stomach. They do not occur anywhere else along the gastrointestinal tract. Let's also mention ulcers. Okay. Well, you could say studying for exams in this class or whatever is giving me an ulcer because it's stress related. Sure, maybe, but let's think about chronic life-threatening ulcers. That's different. Okay. It's not brought on by stress. What it's brought on by, it's actually a bacterial infection. So obviously the bacteria have to be resistant to acid. Then they burrow underneath the mucosal layer. They get beneath the epithelial cells. They now initiate inflammation and they form ulcers. Now, it can potentially become life-threatening because initially it could maybe just be destroying some epithelial cells, but what if we start to get below that to the outer layers? If we actually get into some of the lower layers which have rich vasculature, we could have a bleeding ulcer. That's where you're coughing up blood, and that's where it's coming from. Oh, what happens if it breaches the serosal layer? Oh, that's a hole from inside to outside the inside, and then all your stomach contents now are in your abdominal cavity, and you get gross infection, and you die quite painfully. All right. So ulcers are chronic ulcers anyway, are more complex. Okay. Now, we're in the stomach. Everything's acidified. Remember, there is no lipid digestion. So you have a fatty acid chyme. So that cheeseburger you had, you've got the buns, you got the cheese, and so forth. Nothing's happened. Okay. It's acidified and it's very fatty. Right. Then what happens is that it leaves the stomach and enters the duodenal space of the small intestine. The small intestine is designed to operate at a neutral pH because this is the optimal temperature for all those enzymes and chemical digestion. So what happens is we need to change that chyme. We need to change the effects of that chyme. So what happens is this: as that fatty acid chyme enters the small intestine, it's going to initiate the release of two hormones from the enteroendocrine cells, which are a part of the epithelial cells of your duodenal space. They sense the fatty acid chyme. They're going to release two hormones that I want to talk about: cholecystokinin and secretin. By the way, secretin is the first hormone that was discovered in 1905. All right. So we have secretin and we have cholecystokinin, and they're going to be targeting the accessory digestive organ, the liver. Now, the liver, in the context of the small intestine, is designed to deliver bile salts. So the liver is making bile salts. They're stored in the gallbladder. And then when you eat something fatty and that stuff enters the small intestine, that means that, for instance, the cholecystokinin is going to be enter the bloodstream systemically. It's going to go to the gallbladder. And it's going to initiate contraction. That's going to dump bile salts directly via the bile duct in here to the small intestine. And again, remember, I've already told you that is saponifying the fats and breaking them up. Okay. Now, the secretin targets the hepatocytes that are in the liver, and they are making more of the bile salts. Okay, so we have cholecystokinin and secretin. They're being released by being stimulated by this fatty acid chyme, right? So let me take a moment here and let's talk about. It's getting late in the year, but let's go back to the summer and you went to Iowa State Fair and you had fried butter. Ever had fried butter? So if you go to the Iowa State Fair, take a quarter stick of butter, okay? You roll it in cornflakes, you freeze it, and then you deep fry it. It's like fried ice cream. You've had fried ice cream? Okay. It's delicious. It's a trick. How do you cook something frozen, and then you want to have a nice crust on the outside, and you want it to still be solid on the inside, all right? Butter's easier than ice cream, but it could be ice cream. It can be French ice cream, a lot of fat. Same difference is this. Just think about that butter. That butter is over 50% fat. It is not chemical broken down in the stomach. That begins in the small intestine. So what that means is by the time that enters here, you got a lot of fat, and what happens is the cholecystokinin induces the release of a shitload of bile salts, and that helps to bust up all of that fat. All right. You can have an inflamed gallbladder, and it could be removed, and that means you can't have this rapid release of bile salts. If that happens, you can't eat fried butter or fried ice cream. Actually, you can't eat a lot of things that are very fatty, because what that means is you don't have this huge bolus of bile salts. What that means is that a lot more of the fat doesn't get digested because it doesn't get broken up so that it can be chemically digested. What that means is that a lot more of that fat makes it out of the small intestine into the large intestine, where number one, it can serve as a source of nutrition for the microbiomes. One of the things that can come out of that is methane gas. This can create abdominal pain. Oh, also, what happens? So what happens if you take your hand and put some butter on it and try to keep your hand and push it along something? It really facilitates movement, right? It's a lubricant. It acts in your intestine the same way. So if you don't have a gallbladder and you eat, say, some very fatty material, ice cream, fried butter, what happens is you're going to get diarrhea, because a lot of that fat's going to end up not getting digested, and it's going to facilitate movement of stuff along the gastrointestinal tract, right? All right, so this is the liver, and it's contributing, again, bile salts. What happens to this next one we want to talk about is the pancreas. So they're both stimulated by cholecystokinin and secretin. Both those hormones enter the blood. One goes to the liver and the gallbladder. The other one goes to the pancreas. Now, what happens here is cholecystokinin is going to induce the release of all the enzymes. Okay, enzymes that are targeting proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. The secretin is going to induce the release of bicarbonate-rich secretions, which results in neutralization of the pH. All right. So the pancreas, its goal is to neutralize the pH in the small intestine, so that is optimized for those proteases those enzymes that it also releases. Right. Now, we have this fatty acid chyme in the stomach. Now in the small intestine, we've neutralized that chyme, and we also have broken up those large lipid globules and gotten them smaller to facilitate chemical digestion. Now, in terms of chemical digestion of proteins, the pancreas is contributing three zymogens. We have basically trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, and procarboxypeptidase. Again, these are zymogens. Once they get into the small intestine, they're activated by another set of proteases that are associated with the epithelial cells called membrane-bound endokinase. That activates trypsinogen to trypsin. Trypsin once activates, then activates chymotrypsinogen to chymotrypsin and procarboxypeptidase to carboxypeptidase. Now, here, let me show this. I have to change the position of these slides. What you're seeing here is the lining mucosal layer of the small intestine. Remember, what the small intestine is doing two things. Its job is chemical digestion and absorption. Now, we need to maximize the surface of this tube structure. It's not a simple tube. So if you notice, here is there's a tube, but note that there are all these villi, all right? And we have these undulations, and each of these, here is a villi here, and that's a little stick of tissue coming up. It's lined with epithelial cells. Inside that little villi are a blood vessel and a lymphatic duct, all right? So it's facilitated. So when we have absorption, it goes across. And then if it is amino acids and simple sugars, it goes to the bloodstream. If it's fats, it goes to the lymphatic system. Ultimately, everything targets eventually to the liver. All right. So this is how much this doesn't look anything like the lining layer of the stomach. But the anatomy of the villi are optimized for chemical digestion and absorption. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this. This is where we have our proteases are breaking down proteins. They have this process began in the stomach. It now continues in the small intestine. But instead of acid pH, it's at neutral pH. Ultimately, we get single amino acids for the most part, and they're absorbed directly across the epithelial layer. In the case of fat, remember, it's more complex. We have to disassociate those big globules of fat. We need to optimize and maximize our surface to volume ratio to facilitate chemical digestion. That is the primary purpose of bile salts. Now, but that's not the only thing. So we now have chemical digestion in the luminal space of the small intestine, but now we need to transport the digested components across that epithelial layer, and that is again facilitated by bile salts. They can bind to the fatty acids, etc., facilitate their movement across the epithelial layer. They go directly to the lymphatic system. All right. Now, let's go a little bit more into the liver and the gallbladder. You already know primarily what the gallbladder does, but again, I want to talk a little bit about the unique anatomy of the liver. The liver does a lot of stuff, all right? So I want to talk about a very specific, the liver is divided into something called triads. And a triad is very important, especially in terms of processing absorbed nutrients. Okay, so the portal triad, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, but it consists of a portal arteriole and a portal venule. The portal arteriole is bringing blood from the lungs. Okay, so it's oxygen rich. The portal venule is bringing blood, draining the gastrointestinal tract, pouring oxygen rich in nutrients because they've just been absorbed. All right, and then we also have a bile duct. All right, now the direction of blood is, so we have a triad, and I'll show you a picture, but you have a mixing of the arterial and the venule blood, ultimately draining to leave the liver. Then you have the bile duct, which is going, the fluid flow is in the opposite direction because you're recycling a lot of that bile salts that are still in that portal venule side. All right. So basically, this is what a triad looks like. So we have a portal venule, that's the blue structure, and the red structure is arterial, and blood is going up and in the same direction. It's intermixing as it moves toward the central vein. It drains in the central vein, ultimately is leaving out the portal. Now, the lymphatic system, the bile duct is going, the fluid flow is in the opposite direction, and it's going against the blood flow. That represents both recovered bile salts as well as newly formed bile salts by those lining cells. All right. So this is a portal triad. Now, within the liver, we have cells called hepatocytes. These hepatocytes play the critical role. They're the predominant, but not the only cells in the liver. They produce bile salts. They process these bloodborne nutrients. We use them to store fatty acids, vitamins. That's why when I was a kid, before you had all these vitamin pills, you would take something called cod liver oil or shark liver oil. And the reason is because the liver was heavily high concentrations of these fat-soluble vitamins. And that was a good source of them. Okay. Then we have, so the liver is also important for detoxification. We've kind of gone into that in other aspects. The bile salts, again, I've already talked primarily what I want to talk to you about that, but you can sometimes get something called bile, you get basically these gallbladder stones, okay? And what are these? Basically, they are a result of too much fat deposition in the gallbladder. And basically, this forms a structure called a gallstone. It's called a gallstone because if you ever have held a gallstone, it feels hard. So hundreds, thousands of years, it was thought to be mineral, but there's no mineral in it. It's basically crystallized cholesterol, but it's very hard. At one time, it was thought that these gallstones, especially from goats and other animals, had medicinal advantages. Okay, if you ever get a chance, if you're in Philadelphia, go to the Netter Museum. Okay, all the older medical schools had a museum. The museum was to teach anatomy and show examples of things. If you ever get a chance to go to the Netter Museum in Philadelphia, go. It's fabulous. Okay. Now, aside from seeing the skeleton of a giant, you will see all kinds of things, and one of those will be gallstones. And they show some gallstones this big. Okay. So it's something to see. Okay. Anyways, it's when my boys were young, they were very young. We took them. I couldn't get them out of it. All right. Probably they don't care anymore, but all the kind of gross stuff, you're going to see that at a medical museum. Okay. And that's the closest one for us. Okay. Now, I'm circling back. I've talked about why we have digestive system. That is so that we can maintain metabolism. That means making energy. That means we need those fats, we need those carbohydrates, we need those proteins. They all feed into the Krebs cycle, the TCA cycle, oxidative phosphorylation, whatever you want to call it, creating ATP, right? I'm not going to spend any more time. We talked about that extensively when we were in skeletal muscles. Now, what I do want to mention, which is kind of different, when we were in the endocrine portion, I talked about the role of insulin, okay, in maintaining absorbed blood glucose levels. When they're high, insulin tells the cells to take it up. What I want to introduce here, I want to go beyond sugar, because it isn't just insulin regulates absorbed nutrients. In addition to sugar, amino acids. So just the same thing it's doing with sugar, it's also doing for amino acids. All right. Now, so basically it's directing both skeletal cells and so forth to take up amino acids, which maintains those structures. Now, obviously, we don't worry about that killing you immediately. It's the loss of sugar and loss of being able to maintain metabolism that kills you. All right. But I do expect you to know this, right? Hint, hint. All right, so in addition to metabolism, lastly over here, we have absorption of nutrients that are required to maintain cells and replace cells and maintain tissues and tissue products because we're not self-sustaining. So that is everything circled back. All right. I still have little bit of time, and I want to make it clear. When I used to talk about this, I ignored all the other hormones that are involved in the gastrointestinal tract. There's enough of you need to know. But it's critical, especially given the time we're at today in society, for me to talk about broaden that discussion a little bit. And basically, here are the gastropeptide families, and I want you to focus on what I have up here, and this is the secretin family, and I want you to focus on something called glucagon-like peptides, or gastric, and as well as gastric inhibitory peptides. Why? Because it's in the news, right? Been in the news for some years now, and basically it's driving it's a primary driver of GDP in the Netherlands now. I think it's like 6% of the GDP, and that's all due to the sale of these hormones. They're being used as weight reduction. So obviously this is involving the digestive system. So it's appropriately for me to discuss this. If you happen to take my class in engineering protein therapeutics, we spend a lot more time talking about these hormones. But I want to mention them in terms of digestion. All right. So basically, you eat food. Basically, as you eat food, it's going to result in the release, for instance, of GLP-1 or GIP. These then will be responsible for initiating certain things that I'll talk about. But technically, they're rapidly broken down, which means that, for instance, neither one of these hormones are therapeutically relevant in the native state. What has been critical for enabling this huge use of these hormones as therapies is because these peptides were engineered to resist this normal pathway of degradation. So what do they do? All right. I guess I can spin both that. So this is the gastric inhibitory peptide. This is the GLP-1. So they're both responsible, but they're not the same thing. But let's focus on GLP-1. That's going to be responsible overall for a couple of things. Number one, it's going to go to your brain and tell you that you're full. It also slows digestion as well. So in other words, food stays in the gastrointestinal tract longer, so you're not hungry. So the whole point is to reduce food intake. All right. Now, originally, for instance, the GLP-1, that was originally developed for treatment of type 2 diabetes. Remember, type 2 diabetes is usually associated with obesity. So inherent with impact, and so what you want to do is you want to drive down weight, because that's going to reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes. So this hormone was first used in that regard. What they found, and that's fine, it was extremely successful, but they also found that, if I give it to people who are just obese, not type 2 diabetic, they can be resulting in significant weight reduction. This is where the money is in dietary treatments, okay? Because nothing else really works. Not as well as this. So that's where this came from, and this is where it currently is. And I'll show you a picture in a moment. But one of the problems is, we'll get back to that. We'll get to that in a minute. So that led to 3 years ago, just 3 years ago, that led to the application of Mounjaro and Zepbound. This is basically so type 2 diabetes is 2022, then Zepbound was in 2023 for weight loss. And so basically this began to be used because it showed significant weight reduction. And basically, this was the cost. This is a couple of years ago, at around $1,000. If you remember, there was just some reports from the administration talking about this can be as low as $50 a month and so on. So this can really impact stuff, impact people's lives. All right. Now, some final thoughts. First off, GLP-1. It works, but there's always a but, right? So the but is this. The problem with the GLP-1 is that, yes, it reduces appetite. Yes, it reduces digestive efficiency. It promotes weight loss, but it also results in extreme indigestion, vomit. It initiates a vomiting reflex. So you're uncomfortable. Okay. No one wants to be uncomfortable. So one of the things that you got beyond this is to mix GLP-1 and GIP as a single, as an application, and that kind of overcomes it. There was actually just a report that came out yesterday. I remember listening to on the BBC, and they're talking about discovering that they're going to the brain and seeing where GLP-1 is going. And it is going to the same neural tissues that are also involved with stimulating your vomiting reflexes. So there is now moving toward how can we target cessation but not vomiting. So that knowing all of this, knowing what's happening up here, they can better design the therapies, these proteins, so that they can have a good effect while minimizing the bad effect. But right now, one of the reasons why people stop taking this drug is not because it's expensive, and yes, it's expensive, but because they get tired of all of the other problems, okay? And the problem is, if you go off this drug, you'll gain your weight back. It doesn't stay off permanently, right? So yes, just like with everything, there is good and there's bad. So you have to kind of weigh those things, all right? So there's some other things about these types of drugs as well. They're making significant effects. They're changing society. How are they changing society? If we get such a significant loss in the average weight of a human, this is going to impact transportation. This is going to impact how many people I can pack into an airplane. This is going to impact fashion. So it'll change fashion. It has already significantly impacted diet industry. Many companies that have been around for decades are gone now because they can't compete, right? So also, if I reduce obesity, that means I reduce type 2 diabetes incidence, I reduce chronic disease, which is also associated with that, cardiovascular, et cetera. I've got a healthier population. That's going to free up medical care costs and focus on other things, right? So all of this is being impacted by this one drug, right? And this journey has just begun. It's just a few years old. It remains to be seen where it's going to be in, say, 5 or 10 years, right? So with that, I'm done with the digestive system, all right? And let's see, just to remind you, there is no more quizzes next week. We have one more lecture before the holidays, and we will cover the urinary system. I will say this because I've got a couple of minutes. I always hold the urinary and the respiratory system toward the end. Why? Because I need to cover all the other stuff because they translate to those systems. We can't talk about either of those systems without understanding the circulatory system and how it works, because they're integral parts of both the respiratory as well as the urinary system. We have to understand how filtration works, bulk flow, all of this kind of stuff. So I always say these toward the end. Then, of course, we have all our hormones to be able to talk about, especially in the urinary system. So, but I'll be compressing what normally is 2 lecture periods into 1 lecture period for both of those systems. All right. So with this, that's it for today. I hope to see you guys. I know I'll see you guys in the next little bit in the seminar. All right. So have a good weekend. You do have your final homework due today, I believe, and I think that's the last of your assignments before your exam. Okay? I decided to take that quiz out. Okay.